Really excited about today's episode. This is the Conveyor Podcast. I'm Quinn Lawson, your host. Leadership communications in business is about building relationships in a dynamic environment, impacting change in a positive way to accomplish your goals. And it is harder to think of a more dynamic time than now. On top of that, communications is also about multimedia and interactions and the myriad of ways that the internet has extended our nervous system to act independently on our behalf. Sometimes it feels in magical ways. Communications is part sociology, part technology today, and the way in which they interact together. So we've built this podcast to learn from experienced entrepreneurs and builders about their approach to communications and leadership, both personally, through their careers, and in their roles in the organizations that they serve. And I'm really excited about today's guest because Christopher will be able to shed a huge amount of perspective on where the future of communications is going and how you can think about it in order to capitalize in your business and amongst the relationships that you lead. So quick intro, Christopher Schlaeffer, from the chairman at YOUM, a social media safe space and a UK-based serial entrepreneur. YOUM is a social media content and AI agentic tool that provides a new approach to trusted internet information sources and connections. He was also the CEO of Yetu. Is it Yetu, Christopher, I think?
Perfectly pronounced.
Yetu, an interconnected home platform for web applications. And Christopher has also worked at major telecoms like Deutsche Telekom, Chief Product Innovation Officer, and the CMO at T-Mobile. He helped to launch the Android operating system. And to wrap up, Christopher is also on the International Board of Amnesty International. So welcome today, Christopher. Thanks for being here.
Thank you very much, Quinn. It's a pleasure being with you. Thanks for the invitation.
So earlier in the introduction, I talked about media and the idea, using this Marshall McLuhan idea of how media and technology is an extension of our nervous system. And when I look at your career, you've done a ton of different things around connecting people through communications and also technology. What has been the overriding curiosity that has driven you in your career?
Well, I have to say the overriding curiosity is almost political in terms of what technologies can do to progress a society and how it changes societies. And I found that the information technology, right, is one of the most disruptive instruments to do so. If you look at societal progress, basically there were three levers in history. One was the arts, thousands of years old, right, which really changed society time and again. Then we got science 200 to 300 years ago, and science changed societies. And finally, we now have technology at hand since a long time already, but ever progressing. And these instruments and tools do change the way we communicate, how we live together, how the world is hopefully becoming a better place all of the time with all of these innovations. And that is what interests me.
And let's talk specifically about what YOUM is doing differently. So how, given the, using the idea of how technology through history changes the way that society works, I'm thinking about movable type, the Gutenberg press, and even the impact on, power structures with the priest class and going into native languages, because native type allowed the common layperson to be close to God using that reference back then. So social media is its own disruptive sort of analogy to that historical moment with the Gutenberg press. So within that context, what is YOUM doing differently?
Well, I'm not going to go back to neither the Bible of Wulfila in 470 or the 11th century and the scholastic and the monks who then distributed, language and communication via written efforts, or then the Gutenberg press. All of this has been historical and we know about it. But I'm fascinated by communication and what it does. And if you look from an industrial lens, basically we have two developments of communication. Let's say in the last 100 years, there is the development of personal communication, which went from a human relationship to technology-enabled telephony, being fixed-line telephony 100 years ago, then became mobile, and you could basically place and time shift with communication in the 1990s, and then the internet came, and it was still voice communication. Then it became text-based and email-based, which became an SMS, right, in communication terms, and was then replaced by things like messaging systems, which we use nowadays. And that communication thing and phenomenon has always been personal, between you and me and a few people only, and it had been private, right, and also protected in a way. And at the same time, we had the media industry, which also became digitized and electrified, if you wish, right, over the last 100 years. It was always a hugely regulated one-to-many broadcast type of communication phenomenon. A newspaper editor who was responsible for the content in the New York Times or any other kind of, newspaper out there, and then spreading the news. And that became electronic media with the advent of television and radio. And suddenly social media came in, and we lost that responsibility of the editor, who was not responsible anymore for any content, but suddenly it's turned around and the user should be kind of responsible for the content, which kind of opened Pandora's box. And all the intoxifying kind of results we see today in society, where, especially youth suffers and Gen Z suffers by all these consequences of social media, are a problem in communication, especially because now these two industries merge. Because a couple of years ago, Instagram is one of the market leaders, has added private communication, being messaging, into a social media platform. And all the toxic elements of social media now spill over into something which should be protected and personal. And hundreds of millions of young people in Gen Z are ready for the next phase of communication, where they're looking for safety. 7 out of 10 Gen Z respondents say safety ranks first in their life's priorities. And so YOUM, our company, produces a platform branded YOUM, which stands for you and me, which is your social safe space, which brings communication back into the private domain, just you and your best friends, but not like a text messaging system with add-ons like the WhatsApps of the world developed, but really born in the future with multimedia communication being totally multimodal, supported by generative AI, augmented by large language models to bring agentic AI in and support your context with services. And that's what we are doing as YOUM with our platform branded YOUM.
Can you tell me about the technological difference behind that platform? So what is it that is creating that level of safety and I would say privacy too, probably? So is it peer-to-peer encryption? Is there some sort of difference? I know that when Facebook bought WhatsApp, big part of WhatsApp was that there was encryption from one end to another. And I'm not quite familiar with the ideas of backdoors and what exists either in the United States or in Europe where you are, but what how do you think about this landscape, and what's the current state of this landscape?
Yeah. So first of all, of course, in the first place with the use cases, we using all the technologies supporting multimedia, especially video, audio, GIFs, etc., but also multimodality in terms of speech to text, text to speech, translation, transcription, all of these things, but also real-time video to video AI to kind of improve the quality of a recorded video. So all of that is there, but at the core of your question really is our technology architecture. And we have found that end-to-end encryption in communication is one thing, and it does help. But of course, something which is end-to-end encrypted can also be decrypted with a key on a server. And sometimes, right, when a judge comes in or a government or an agency, we do see that decryption on these encrypted platforms, so not safe. And everything is, in essence, still stored on a server. What we did, we cutting out the server as a storage element and go back to almost a bit of a romanticism around peer-to-peer communication. Like 20 years ago, we had a Napster, right, in music and all of these pirate type of models, but we're going there and we are storing all the data and all the algorithms of generative AI only decentrally on a device. So your data never leaves the phone to be processed on a server. And that becomes hugely important, not only in protecting privacy in the first place, but then when you think about the usage of generative AI and large language models, our hypothesis is that people with their very personal data will be hugely hesitant to send it into a server-based LLM, which is run by the technology giants out there, and then basically can deal with your communication history or email history or your private context. We do believe that users will prefer an option where the LLM runs on device, never leaves your phone or your pocket in that regard, and then can render services which are totally protected and private in that regard. So that privacy element is a fundamental element of our technology architecture, which is not that easy to come up with in such a system.
I use some wonderful tools for voice to text on my device, and I've used natively on my desktop Ollama or some other open source tools for reviewing things like contracts, things that I don't necessarily want to be put over the internet. But even then, as someone who's familiar with technology, but I'm not necessarily a coder or technology, I can't audit myself type of thing. I understand how challenging it is to build trust with an end user. There are early adopters using the adopter curve that everyone is familiar with. There are people who will really, really want this, who are privacy geeks and want to test and just be familiar with this sort of thing. But then there is sort of the early majority, which there are people who are just solving problems. So how do you develop trust? What's it been like going to market, even though it's, you sound that like the architecture, that it's very well thought out, but it's one thing to catch busy people every day.
Yeah, and that is very much, an issue of branding and of defining your unique selling proposition, the USP, and how to differentiate. And we have for a long time tried to come up with technological arguments, and users did not care about that really, right? It was too complex to explain. Users want to have something they can relate to emotionally also, and the emotion of users is that they feel unsafe increasingly in their communication platforms today because they are trolled on their social media platforms, they are harassed, they are followed by bots in that regard, they are being direct messaged by people they don't know, they are hated and disliked and subject to all of these problematic things. And they really have that emotional desire to have safety in their life. And hence, we changed the brand positioning from things like a better communication platform with these and that features to YOUM, your social safe space. And that is something people immediately understand. It's not about privacy or data protection in these words, right? It's a social safe space. And that is something people relate to, and that did the job for us. So it is very much a different level of explaining things, because at the end of the day, communication is a deeply human dimension of life, right? You communicate to your loved ones, to people who matter to you, and it has to do a lot with emotions, and you cannot solve that with technical terms.
So I'd like to talk about the imperative. This is a burning platform today with deep fakes, with the internet becoming a less safe place by the day. But I'd like to ask you about it from the perspective of your work history here. So you've talked about launching Android. What were you involved with? Tell me a bit about that experience.
Android, of course, was a startup created in 2002 by Andy Rubin, right, who was leading Android all the way through. That company got acquired by Google in 2004 and then launched the Android operating system in 2008. And I was part of that team in a New York subway station in September 2008. There was Andy Rubin, me, and Peter Chu presenting the first ever, phone on that Android operating system. And Larry Page and Sergey Brin were roller skating through New York with an Android robot posed on their back and joined us in the press conference. And that was the historic moment when the world's most successful operating system for computing devices was basically publicly born. And I was involved all the way through from 2002 to 2008 from my role at Deutsche Telekom, because Deutsche Telekom was a technology partner for that, and we came up with the first basically mobile phone for the Android operating system. So that was it. And what was fascinating and what of course played a huge role with Android is it was the first open mobile operating system. We came to this point with only closed systems. If you look at the computing history, right? Very much a Microsoft-dominated planet since the 1980s, with an operating system which was MS-DOS and Windows and all incarnations of Windows, with a few verticals which were intertwined like Word, Excel, and PowerPoint. And a software developer could never enter that ecosystem because it was such a proprietary system. And now Android comes up with an open mobile operating system for the phone the first time and introduces, together with Apple, who came up with the App Store also only in 2008, a year after launching the iPhone, with also the App Store paradigm, which said we're inviting all the creativity of developers in from around the world who can, in a very democratic way, now use this distribution channel to bring their innovation to market. And that was the fascinating part of it. Though a few years later already, we saw that that dream of millions of app developers being out there and distributing their creativity was somewhat flawed by the giants in Silicon Valley and China really dominating, and what emerged was an oligopoly of 10, 15 companies owning all the 50 applications which users would ever use, right? All the YouTubes, Amazons, Google searches, etc. are part of that oligopoly. So I became a bit kind of critical a few years later about how that really kind of materialized. And I have born that idea of YOUM then in 2012, the first time I published about a contextual internet. And a contextual internet would be something where the context of communication would be clear enough to actually pull a service in, and you wouldn't even have to know as a user that that service existed. So you could say a sentence like, why don't we go for lunch next Wednesday in this Italian restaurant in New York at 1 p.m. And that one single sentence said, you need a calendar entry, I need a calendar entry. You need Google Maps because you're using the bicycle to get to the restaurant. I order or hail a cab in New York, so that needs to be hailed, and we need a table booking. It's already 5 apps, so you and I might know these apps and how you hail a cab. My mother has never hailed a cab on the internet or booked a table in a restaurant. So by simply saying that sentence, all the services could come in and the user would not need to know anymore which services exist out there, because there's 3 million apps in all of these Play and App Stores. And what you have created by that, and I of course didn't have these terms in 2012, which was 13 years ago, is an unprompted LLM. An LLM which you don't need to prompt. It's a large language model where the context is the prompt. And that is what we are building with our agentic AI into the YOUM platform. So you totally protectedly talk to your friends, and whenever a service could augment that conversation and help, it comes in magically without the user having to do anything.
When you paint the picture of Android having just launched and the gigantic shift from mobile carriers to like, let's say traditional telecom with just phone numbers and maybe brick breaker or whatever on your phone, to this app store, I think about the fundamental idea of, which is my company, which is Community Company. It's like, it's a community. You turn from being a provider, which is the traditional telecom model, to this ecosystem. You're essentially a marketplace, which is what communities sometimes are. It's about people coming in, and the beauty of the marketplaces with these app stores is that you are facilitating supply and demand. You don't have to identify what the demand is and service it. You just have to facilitate users, and then within a subset of users, someone else within the ecosystem providing supply. But like any community, over time, cultures shift, and the technology, the fundamental way the community operates, can impact the quality of that culture, and also the actors that can come in, that can get market share, that can introduce new things that aren't really foreseen over time. And so what I'd like to ask you is about the impending impact of AI for the negative, for the potential negative, because of deep fakes, or this lack of trust that you're talking about, that YOUM is solving. So just even in the last couple of weeks, there's been all of these social media posts about the quality of videos, and they just say, hey, this is a giant disaster, and then they're like, oh, by the way, this is fake. And so the quality of the community that these, Android or iOS, or even just internet communications is we are getting to, that the content creation abilities are exceeding our individual ability to have enough I wouldn't say intelligence, but maybe street smarts, I would say, to discern what is trusted what communications are actually being in the moment. So from your perspective, from your experience, what is the issue right now?
It is a super complex question, and we are only scratching the surface, right? Nobody knows is the answer today what really will be the issue on the negative side. But before we go there, and I will go there, let's first of all talk about the positive side of that generative AI and the potential, right? Really, we're talking about something which is just not a new technology. It could be the new operating system of the world in a way, right? Maybe there is no Android anymore soon, right? Because it is replaced by something else like Gemini within Google, or something else outside Google. In that operating system, the agentic AI clearly will overcome the App Store phenomenon, that you need to go somewhere, learn about new apps, download them, learn how to use them. That is all a phenomenon of the past, because the agent takes that role, right, and reverses the system. So all of these things are tremendously interesting, not to talk even about every single vertical industry in the world being again turned upside down by these things, whether that's in industrial clusters or in B2C models, etc. So I'm fascinated and hugely positive. Then in the middle is a huge role for the regulator in this regard, right? That, of course, bounces a bit back and forth 2-3 years. Even industry leaders in Silicon Valley said we need heavy regulation, or they say we need no regulation. That will bounce back, but we do need it because, of course, we do have this phenomenon, like you alluded to, the whole deepfake thing, right? And media in that regard is a huge problem. Now, there is all kinds of avenues to solve that thing. Primitive things like watermarking, etc., can help, but can that be undermined is a question. But then you come back to that question whether a platform owner or the editor of a social media platform actually has content responsibility. Because imagine if the YouTube owner or the Facebook or Instagram owner had responsibility for the content published there, that would change the game in terms of all the mechanism which would be suddenly introduced in these platforms to safeguard that there is no deep faking and no lie and no alternative facts and this and that, because you could be sued. basically, if something is wrong. But because we inverted that, that's difficult. But that whole deepfake and media topic is to watch, right, in terms of political influence and what we see. But there's a lot of other issues, right? There's the whole ethical debate, for instance, in healthcare, right? The question of digital twins and what do you do with the data and how far does that go in that regard, right? You could go into all kinds of domains, and we need to be vigilant. That's why I would love to see the most gifted people on earth not only always go into technology, but also in politics, right? Because we need these super smart regulators who are not 6 years behind, but ahead of the curve in these discussions. And what do you do, and what type of actually technology and internet and AI environment do you want as a society? Defining that is one of the best roles I can think of.
And excuse me. And in regards to this moment in history, in telecommunications, multimedia history, from your time working at the telecoms, working on Android, what's the magnitude of this moment versus the previous moments that you've participated in?
That is so hard to judge when you live in the moment, right? You always in that moment think it's the most explosive thing on earth, right? I remember the day when I held my first mobile phone in hand and could talk over the air to somebody. I thought, this is actually the most magical thing I ever saw. When Tim Cook in my office in Germany put the first iPhone on my table before it was launched, because Apple wanted to work with us as a strategic partner outside the US. I could not believe that you could touch something, right, and browse the internet like that. And then you came into all kinds of miracles of technology, and then AI. It's hard to say, but of course it's ever accelerating. And that tool set is so powerful, but it's also not something which goes so fast, right? We have Minsky publishing on AI in 1958. And since I was a teenager, I was fascinated by AI. This was the early 1980s. How long did that take until November 2022 when ChatGPT was launched to the public, right? And had that massive adoption immediately and changed everything. It's just 3 years ago, and we are just starting to learn about that, right? So hard to judge, but fascinating, of course.
Very diplomatic. It's good. That's good. Some of my experiences, my first year of university was basically the 40th or 50th school that had Facebook. And so I started a Facebook group who is in my hometown for the summer, and it expanded to about 8,000 people.
Wow.
And I didn't know the power of that type of group. And as a millennial, right on the bubble, I always thought this was going to be a plaything. I experienced the things I posted, friends partying, etc. They were just throwaway type of things. And little did I know that everyone up to, not quite my grandma, but many of my friends' grandmothers would get onto that platform.
Yeah.
It's incredible. And then other things like being exposed to like Bitcoin very early. It's quite remarkable how hard it is to feel the shift in the way we interact with each other in the moment, I believe. There was a great quote that I heard too that, things aren't actually moving very fast. There's just thousands of things moving very slowly. And we get a lot of exposure to thousands of things moving very slowly. And some of those interactions are when I've chatted with ChatGPT on voice. I remember very early on using voice and transcription for my agency, and I would have to pay $200 for a transcriptionist to sit and listen and type everything up. And now a part of that service is instantaneous. As soon as we get off this call, it will be transcribed instantly, and to a pretty good degree, other than proper nouns, I believe.
Yeah, it is fascinating, isn't it? And also how other competitors, of course, catch up, right? If you look at the metrics of the models, how they almost commoditize in a virtual 6-7 months, right? And everybody is kind of at the same quality. We're talking 10-15 providers already of these models. And where does that then go in terms of horizontal general purpose models? And then, of course, the other track of vertically specialized models and where that goes. It will be fascinating to watch, but especially with transcription and also translation and using voice access and voice control. It's fascinating how accurate it is also, right?
So far, we've talked about your view on the macro, your view on telecom history, the state of AI, what you're doing with YOUM. Let's talk about you as the entrepreneur. So we've established that the world's very dynamic at the moment. Tell me about the sort of your team structure and how you build a team and work with all of your relationships in order to be successful.
Yeah, I have changed that a lot in my life. I had, of course, the privilege to work in all kinds of contexts. I had situations where 50,000 people would report to me in giant companies directly. I had companies which were super small. I had teams which were kind of a middle ground of that. What I learned as an entrepreneur in the last 15 years is that I personally very much prioritize super small teams, almost like an artist studio, where you have 5-6 people who constantly communicate about everything, know about every detail, and you're never lost in translation. And that can only be a few functions, right? It is, of course, the leadership of the company in itself. With me as an executive chairman and CEO, then you need a very strong technology genius at your side. Otherwise, you cannot do that. Design is super crucial for me. I never outsource design, so I do it in-house in the deepest way in that regard. And then kind of the core of go-to-market growth hacking, but not very deep. So that actually really the leadership team is together. I very well remember always when Steve Jobs told me about his circle of fire he meets every Monday morning, only 8 people who had to know everything. And we're also not allowed to delegate much in terms of bringing a vice president in to present. So Tim Cook at that time had to know everything about his domain as a COO and present in that team. And Steve Jobs would not allow that 6 departmental leaders come in and represent because the leader doesn't know, right? So that is kind of the model. I mirrored that very much with artists, with leading artists in the world. I had the privilege to be exposed to. And it was always like that, like in Michelangelo's time, a small studio, down to a very important architect today, that they work with very small teams and then define an interface to the outside world where they outsource. And the interfacing, of course, in terms of the technology tool set with all the hyperscalers out there and the platforms available is very easy in terms of operations. So that is easy. In terms of the development process, you cannot operate with an interface which is wireframe based or even a requirements document. What I do is I deliver ready-made 100% completed designs down to the detail of every button and footnote, so that the developer who is then in an outsourcing company around the globe, I use different time zones in the company, Europe, Asia, etc., that we can work around the globe, can just not misinterpret what the end product is. So that is very important, how you outsource, and that you flexibly also changing outsourcing partners, because sometimes you lose the speed, you lose the energy, you lose also the creativity, which you lose very much on the go-to-market side, right? So there's no point working with the same agency like you did in the past all your life. It's just great if you have kind of the strategic wisdom inside with 2 or 3 people, but then constantly employ different fresh minds into a kind of problems in growth hacking. And that's how you can kind of be fast and scale the most. So this, I think, is in rough terms how we operate at YOUM.
how did your experience leading the very large organizations at the telecoms inform wanting to use this model? Because I actually do like that model. And just to sort of reiterate my understanding, you're talking about having a small internal team where all the strategy is done, high context. You talk about everything. Everyone has their functional areas that you trust, but you at least know how to talk to each other and help make decisions together. And then outside of that circle, you have doers. You have people who do stuff that you give complete context to. You provide down to the pixel perfect, you said, for design, and it's just sort of transactional. It's transactional, but you probably have trusted contractors or trusted outside sources that do things. So actually the next question instead is, what about other stakeholders? So let's talk about stakeholders that I would consider above the organization. So let's talk about investors, maybe advisors, and customers. So let's talk about advisors first. What sort of network do you have there? How do you interact with those people?
Maybe I jump even back to your first question. How did I learn from my past to get that system? I didn't learn that so much in big industrial conglomerates, which of course have always the issue of being too large and too slow and having a layer of middle management where things get stuck. But you compete against large others and you just need to be incrementally better than others to win, right? So that's there. I actually was more disillusioned in my early technology days as an entrepreneur 15 years ago with Yetto, where I deployed all these, fashionable things at the time, Agile and Scrum teams and Scrum Masters. At the end of the day, I had 100, 120 people in the company with 10, 15 Scrum teams. And I looked at that process every week when, we had a weekly meeting and the daily meetings. And these Scrum teams did not know anymore where the forest is. They just were lost in the trees. It was so ineffective. So it was the most disappointing experience of my technology life to be in that fashionable domain. Is that this is just, it's just fashionable crap. And
you also don't seem like someone who wants to command an organization like that as well.
Yeah. So that it didn't work, right? And then reducing the size was good. And then, of course, you need to develop the trust through your partners out there. And then these stakeholders you are talking about, they, of course, always kind of differently important. First of all, there's the customer, right? And to innovation, you have kind of two different approaches. The one is, which people talk so much about, we fail fast and pivot all the time and listen to the customer with data-driven. 90% of companies are like that. We are not like that because we are rather in that camp where Steve Jobs was with the iPhone, who never asked a single customer what they would want and presented the iPhone after 5 years of development, right? So there is both. If you have a lot of experience, but it's of course the more risky approach, you can kind of dream up what could be successful out there and have product market fit and not go with an MVP after 2 weeks and then pivot and you start, with flowers and end up with chewing gum, right, as a product. That is not how I operate. We are very much coming from an idea of a business model. I told you that in 2012, I published that idea, which we are now, delivering in the marketplace. And we are very, very stringent in following a strategy in that. So that's why the customer is important for us for reconciliation. So we do a lot of focus groups, but with completed products, not kind of in phase 0 of a business development design or product development idea, but with something users can touch, because users are also kind of, they have choices out there and they will even not engage with an MVP or a wireframe anymore very much. You have to really show them what magic it can be done. So that's the user part. And that's not arrogance. It's just a different approach. We do need the user, but it's hard to ask a student what in 15 years will be successful in the marketplace, right? It's a very complex question. So that's there. The investor, We are still very early stage, so we have no institutional investment yet in the company, but we have 15 of the most prominent, but all private angel investors in the company. We are very happy with them. And as this is an early phase, there is no institutionalized governance yet. So we draw on them in terms of their support and of their advice in specific situations. But as we are kind of not students starting up, but I'm an older man, right? I have, of course, a good network also of people which I can use as a sounding board, even outside the investor domain. And then, of course, there's also the public domain and journalists where you start to behind the scenes talk a bit. But the team members, of course, are super important for me as well, right? Because they are so much in the know, and to develop a culture where you really invite people in to also hold against something. There's always a bit of a danger when you have experienced founders that, and I'm not free of that, to be a Mr. Know-it-all or to be a Miss Know-it-all. And if you can develop a culture that your young people can hold against, that is actually where beauty lies.
You're really painting the picture of like a Steve Jobs, or as Henry Ford said, if we asked the customer, they would have asked for faster horses, is another famous line. And if you have I always say that I work with subject matter experts, and there's two types of subject matter experts. There's people who have 20 years or so of industry experience, and through earning that experience, they have insights around how the future is going to operate, and then they go and execute on that. And they may or may not use incremental data, responding, as you said, start with flowers, end with bubble gum. But sometimes their insight is, I'm going to leapfrog what's currently happening and get ahead to this next paradigm shift. And of course, there's risk, as you said, around, doing it. But if you have that belief, you have that vision, then you can execute on it. And if you have the resources, the deep relationships around people taking that risk with you, then go for it. The other type of person that I work for, the other type of subject matter expert, are the people who don't know. So I always say the university graduate, maybe the Y Combinator founder, who they don't have these preconceived or structural, experiences. And so they just, through their sometimes ego, sometimes just being really gifted and skilled, they go and build something new. But either, it's taken me a long time to say subject matter expert, I think. And it's either from earned insights or deep vision. And it sounds like you have a bit of both with that. So how are you using thought leadership, and sounds like you've had to sell your team, your investors, and even customers, and you're probably a little early to be working with PR and media, but because you're really focused on product, I would assume, through your career and even now, how do you use thought leadership or in the everyday when you're pitching or you're talking to a customer, but also how have you used it to attract people to what you're doing?
Yeah. Of course, thought leadership is attractive to everybody, right? That's why we listen to other people, right? And read and etc. So it is, first of all, I think very simple in life. You have to find the time to take in, right? If you spend your life to just, producing and generating and not taking in, you're on the wrong trajectory, right? There are people like Warren Buffett saying that they read for 80% of their awake time. I think it's a very good idea to take in the majority of your, day, and not always only put out, because otherwise you're standing still on a pace which is not up to the game anymore. So taking in, I was very privileged. In my early industrial days, I was working for Deutsche Telekom in the 1990s, which was Europe's most valuable company. Telecoms in the 1990s was the coolest thing on earth. You cannot even imagine anymore, right? It's so long ago. And I was the chief strategy officer, which meant that into my office every single day, the best management consultants, the best investment bankers, the best technologists came in order to give advice, whom we should acquire, with whom we should merge, how we should transform the company, what technology could be employed. And it was just wonderful, right, in that situation, because you could suck it all up for years. And we're talking about all of these people, including the Bill Gateses of the world, you would meet in such a role, right, in these early states. And the Rupert Murdochs came by and etc. And that was not a rarity. It was just my daily life. And I was in that role to be kind of the head of strategy of that giant company for almost a decade, right? So that was really something which produced a foundation in me. And I did understand business models, not only in telecommunications, but in technology as well, in the transition. So that helped always a lot. And I kept these networks also very much to draw on them, bring the thought leadership in. And then when you turn it around, of course, in recruiting, for instance, and building teams, young people flock to that, right? If there's somebody who can kind of not say, well, I have no idea what tomorrow happens, but take the risk and say, what I think this is the way it's going to go, right? And we would like to do A and not Z because of these reasons. And it's an audacious move. And we are taking 5 times to go there in the development. And people do subscribe to these things a lot. And that is the beauty with the young people. I love very much also in my, entrepreneurship endeavors to not have middle management and people who are middle experienced. We have kind of very experienced founders, and then we bet on the very young and develop them because we know how to do that, right? How to grow people and how they flourish in only 2-3 years and how they explode is just phenomenal to watch, and also a pure joy in essence.
As someone who's in the world of innovation, working at Deutsche Telekom, also being the CEO of Y2, while also your persona gives off someone who I like having my head down and building. And so what's the tension between casting your, consciously spending time selling your thought leader, your vision, the things that are hard to understand, things that don't necessarily have the right language, the common language around it, while also being heads down and building so that the product eventually speaks for itself. So I ask this as a content creator who tries to work with early stage builders who quite often, as a Canadians statistically compared to American companies, there's statistics on this that we're very good at technology. And in telecom, right, there's Nortel, there's Bell Labs, there's BlackBerry, but we hypothetically, from the research, I don't know if it's cherry picked or not, we hire less sales, less marketing later in the product life cycle than American counterparts. And so the assumption then is that we don't capture a market because we wait too long to go to market. And I think that thought leadership, marketing is a fundamental part of that. So do you have any thoughts on this from your experience, the right way to go about that?
I think it's deeply personal at the end of the day, right? For every one of us as a leader, I'm also in that Canadian camp, right? I tend to first have something to show and then go out instead of having a PowerPoint deck and traveling the world with the idea. It's also in terms of how you culturally kind of grow up, right? In my case, I'm waiting to be invited to somewhere, right? And then when I'm invited to speak at a conference or be in a podcast, then I do speak about things, right? But what I don't do so much is I don't ask so many people to be invited, right? Which Americans might do in that regard, right? To constantly think about. And that is for sure also a deficit if you're natured in that way. But I think it comes down a bit to the leader. At the end of the day, I think if you look at innovation, it of course segments, right? There is some breakthrough innovation which in itself will just explode at some point of the day. Then you have a middle ground in the market, right? where marketing, of course, is the differentiating force and only that, right? And then things which basically are not that successful. I'm striving to be in that camp of breakthrough things, right? Which kind of produce a pull in a marketplace without requiring so much marketing budget. But it's of course a difficult thing because the times are also over where we can do it without, right? Google, of course, launched without much, go-to-market and marketing. I think it took them 12 years to have the first ad somewhere in a newspaper, and it was really, their public relations and word of mouth. But then you look into the more contemporary times and look back into how TikTok launched in the US 6-7 years ago, and only in 4 months they spent $1 billion in marketing budget to produce the first swing, and people thought this is kind of organic, but it was the opposite of it, right?
Yeah, it seems that there are those breakthrough technologies that are just so much better that people get drawn towards it. There are also technologies that have these viral loops within them. Think of the Facebook add your 100 friends or add your contact list type of thing, even though it is also a breakthrough. And then there are sort of red oceans, the red oceans of just, marketing. We have to throw dollars at it. And TikTok was slightly a breakthrough, even though musically the thing it required was also, sometimes it's a breakthrough because of the market that it goes after as well. The dancing on TikTok. But I really appreciate the chat today. This has been fantastic. We touched on a lot of things I love to talk about, not just communications, but technology history, moment in time. And then learning about you as a leader, how you think about what you're building and the team that you're building around it, and how you operate on top of what you're building too.
Well, thank you so much, Quinn. It was a pleasure talking to you. What a great conversation always with you, and thanks for inviting me.
Thanks, Christopher. Talk to you soon.